The grand hall glittered under golden lights, the clinking of crystal glasses mingling with laughter and smooth jazz. It was the perfect scene for a celebration. For everyone else, not for James Whitmore. He stood in a shadowed corner near the bar, silently watching a room where his every step once commanded attention. But tonight, they walked past him, as if he were a structural column essential for holding the room up, yet completely unseen. Their gazes slid over him, cold and quick, before landing on Bobby Langston, his esteemed partner, who stood in the center of a congratulatory circle, accepting praise for the very deal James had poured his own blood, sweat, and sleepless nights into. A silver-haired investor with a booming voice raised his glass to Bobby. "You were the soul of this project, my boy. Without you, no one believed it would succeed." Bobby smiled, his voice deceptively modest. "I just did my part. It was a team effort. A team effort." The words sounded humble, but the quick glance he shot toward James was a cold, sharp cut, a silent reminder that he'd been pushed out of the spotlight, his voice silenced in the triumph of his own creation. James took a sip of whiskey. The smoky bitterness slid down his throat, while a different, acrid taste clung to the back of his tongue. 15 years he'd spent building this company from an office the size of a garage, and now he was reduced to an outsider at the victory party for his own win. The averted handshakes, the shallow greetings, each one was a small, systematic reminder that he was being neutralized. Across the room, Evelyn Shaw, his assistant for over a decade, brushed past him with a folder in her hand. Not a word, just a brief, guarded glance that couldn't hide its caution. That look told him everything. You are no longer necessary. If you've ever stood in a room where you thought you belonged, only to feel as lost as a stranger, you know exactly how deep that feeling goes. And sometimes, hearing a story like this, you feel the urge to leave a line in the comments, because maybe, somewhere out there, someone else has been treated as if they don't exist. James left the hall as another round of toasts began. He walked slowly along the stone veranda, the cool, damp mist settling on the shoulders of his suit jacket. Tonight, the streets of Charleston were slick with rain, the gaslight stretching into shimmering ribbons on the wet cobblestones. He walked slowly, as if each click of his heel was counting down the time he had left in the position he'd fought so hard to earn. In the distance, his white Range Rover was parked silently under the canopy of an old oak tree, raindrops pattering on the roof. He'd chosen this street for its quiet, its lack of passers-by, its absence of prying eyes. Everything was under his control. At least he thought it was. His hand had just touched the door handle when another hand, small and cold, clamped over his mouth from behind. A ragged breath ghosted past his ear, followed by a trembling but fierce whisper. "Don't say anything. They're listening." He spun around to find the wide eyes of a little girl, no older than 6. Her hair was tangled, her sweater damp with rain, and her cheeks were smudged with dirt. But her gaze was bright with sharp, startling awareness. In that instant, 1,000 questions exploded in James's mind. Who? Who was listening? And why him? The injustice from the party still burned in his chest. But now, it was joined by a chill that ran down his spine. The little girl looked him straight in the eye and whispered again, "If you want to live, be quiet and listen to me." And if you're listening to this and the question, "What the hell is going on?" just flashed through your mind, then you might want to stick around until the end of this story. Or maybe leave a comment below, because perhaps you, too, have been pulled into a situation you could never have seen coming. Before James could react, the streetlight at the end of the block illuminated the silhouette of a tall man in a long raincoat, standing motionless, watching them. James froze, the little girl's hand still pressed firmly against his mouth. Her eyes weren't fearful, as he'd expected, but strangely resolute for a child. Her voice dropped to a mere breath. "They knew you'd take this street. They were already here." And he gently pried her small hand away, keeping his own voice low. careful not to break the thick silence that enveloped them. "Who are you?" "Lily. Lily Harper. And what were you doing in my car?" Lily shot a quick glance down the street, where the rain-coated figure remained still as a statue. "Don't talk so loud. They'll hear. They've been talking about you for days." James followed her gaze. The man didn't move, didn't wave, just stood there, the yellow lamplight casting a faint halo over his shoulder. A strange feeling crept over him, as if he were the prey, and the target had already been locked. Who was talking? Two people. A man named Bobby. A woman named Evelyn. The answer was a cold knife, piercing the composure James had been struggling to maintain all evening. Bobby Langston, the friend, with whom he'd scraped together the first dollars to start the company. Evelyn Shaw, his right hand, the woman who had managed his schedules, his mail, his contracts for over a decade. Those names couldn't have come from the lips of a strange child, unless she'd actually heard them. He asked, his voice still a whisper. "Where did you hear this?" "In the old seafood warehouse, near the docks. Sometimes I sleep there, when it's too cold." Her voice faltered for a moment, but her eyes never left his. "They said that after Thursday, you would disappear." The word disappear echoed in James's head, mingling with the steady patter of rain on the car roof like a ticking clock. This couldn't be just about business. No one used that word for a simple corporate shuffle. He replayed the moment at the party. Bobby being praised, Evelyn avoiding his gaze. Every small detail of the night was snapping into a sharp, terrifying picture. A plan where he was no longer in the driver's seat. Lily leaned forward, her voice more urgent. "You have to leave. Right now." Before James could answer, the figure in the raincoat began to move. Not quickly, not in a rush, but each step seemed to measure the distance to the car. The rhythm of his approach drowned out the sound of the rain. James hit the lock. The driver's seat molded to his familiar form as he slid in, Lily scrambling into the back. The engine turned over. A quiet but decisive roar. In the rear-view mirror, he saw it clearly. The man in the raincoat had stopped in the middle of the street, turned fully toward them, his head tilted slightly, as if memorizing every detail. There was no urgency in his posture. But everything in James screamed that this was no coincidence. James pulled away from the curb. Rain streaked across the windshield, blurring the world outside. Inside the car, the smell of leather mixed with the damp wool of Lily's sweater. He spoke, his voice for the first time stripped of its pretense. "What else do you know? They know where you eat dinner, what time you come home, the color of your car. They know your house. And they said you were in the way." That phrase was another drill bit. James steered the car around a corner and onto the main road. He realized he was automatically heading to a quieter place, a small coffee shop at the marina, where he always went to think. A place where no one paid attention. When he parked in front of the shop, mist from the harbor crept between the buildings, mingling with the rich scent of coffee. The windows were fogged, the yellow light inside, soft and muted. James and Lily stepped inside, a small bell on the door chiming softly. The waitress glanced at them, her eyes flicking from his tailored suit to the little girl's serious face. Without a word, she silently poured 2 mugs of hot water. James chose a corner booth, his back to the wall, so he could see the entire room. He couldn't shake the feeling that the eyes of the man in the raincoat were still fixed on the back of his neck. Lily sat across from him, her small hands wrapped around the warm mug, the steam pinking her thin fingers. He knew it with certainty. This wasn't just about being pushed out of a deal. This was a much bigger game, and from the moment this little girl got into his car, he had been placed at the very center of the board. Outside, the rain continued to fall, a thin layer of fog clinging to the window pane, obscuring the figure of a person who had just stepped out of a black sedan parked a short distance away. The bell on the coffee shop door chimed again, this time admitting a gust of damp, cold air from the harbor. James looked up, and framed in the doorway was a face so familiar, it sparked a flood of memories. Caroline Fields. She walked in, pulling off her rain hood, a few strands of dark brown hair clinging wetly to her cheeks. Her police uniform couldn't hide her natural agility. Caroline's eyes swept the room, settled on James, and then narrowed slightly when she saw Lily sitting across from him. "James Whitmore. Didn't expect to see you here at this hour." As said, her tone was light, but it was layered with an unmistakable curiosity. James replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "Caroline. It's been a while." She pulled out a chair and sat without waiting for an invitation, her gaze shifting to Lily. "And this is—" Lily shrank back slightly, glancing at James. He answered immediately, as if to head off any suspicion. "Lily. She's with me." Caroline raised an eyebrow, but didn't press. She turned her attention back to James, leaning forward slightly, her voice low. "You're hiding something. I can see it." James's composure wavered. He'd known Caroline long enough to understand that once she decided to look into something, she wouldn't stop until she found the truth. He also remembered how many times in the past she'd pulled him back from a reckless decision with a single sentence. "Something happened tonight," James said, glancing at Lily as if for permission. The little girl gave a small nod, her hand still cradling the mug. He recounted the story in brief. The warning, Lily mentioning Bobby and Evelyn's names, the man in the raincoat. Caroline listened without interrupting. Only when James mentioned the seafood warehouse did her eyes darken. "That area isn't safe. If she really heard that there, then they're more confident than I thought." James leaned forward, his elbows on the table. "I need to know what they're planning, and I can't do this alone." "You say that like you trust me." "I do." A moment of silence passed, then Caroline nodded. "Then we won't go in head-on. We'll get proof. Once we have it, they'll have nowhere to run." Lily's hands left the mug and slid to the center of the table. "I know the spot in the warehouse where they talk. I can show you." Her voice was so calm that James had to look at her again. It wasn't the calmness of a child, but of someone accustomed to living in dangerous territory. Caroline looked from Lily to James. "If we're going, we have to go now. The longer we wait, the more time they have to cover their tracks." James nodded. He felt, in the warm, coffee-scented air, that a fragile alliance had been forged between a CEO pushed out of the spotlight, a cop carrying old memories, and a child with nothing left to lose. Outside, the rain began to fall harder again, drumming on the shop's tin roof like a distant beat. Through the sound, James clearly heard the footsteps of someone stopping just outside the fogged-up window, standing perfectly still, as if waiting for the right moment to come inside. The road to the docks was almost completely deserted. Streetlights cast lonely pools of light onto the wet pavement, stretching the shadow of the Range Rover into a distorted shape. Inside the car, no one spoke much. Each was silently rehearsing what needed to be done and what could go wrong. James glanced in the rearview mirror. Lily sat in the middle of the back seat, her eyes fixed on the window, as if reading every shadow that flew by. Carolyn sat in the passenger seat, a small map spread across her lap, her finger marking the location of the seafood warehouse. "We'll go in from the back," Caroline said quietly. "Is that side guarded?" James asked. "Usually no, but tonight, I wouldn't bet on anything." The smell of salt and cold air seeped into the cabin as they got out of the car. The pier stretched out like a black rib cage in the darkness, the sound of waves lapping beneath it. The old seafood warehouse loomed ahead, gray, weather-beaten wood walls, its windows opaque with dust and salt spray. Lily walked quickly to James's side, pointing to a corner of the warehouse where fishing nets were piled high. "This door latch is stuck. You just have to lift it a little, and then push." Her voice was as confident as if she'd done this many times before. James tried it. The latch clicked, the wood groaned softly, and the door gave way. The inside was pitch black, the air thick with the smell of old fish, machine oil, and a damp chill. The floorboards creaked under every footstep, the sound swallowed by the vast, dark space overhead. Caroline signaled for silence, then pointed to a small door on the side. A faint light seeped through the crack, along with the sound of rustling paper and metal on metal. James moved closer, gently pushing the door open a little further. Inside, a low wooden table was covered with papers, a few bound files, and in the middle, a half-open envelope. He stepped in, moving quickly but carefully, his eyes scanning the headings. Operational Control Transfer Agreement. Emergency Activation Clause. List of transferred assets. The words were cold and clinical. But to James, each one was a spike. They weren't just about the company, they were about erasing his name from the very thing he had built. He flipped to one page, and his heart tightened. His name was at the top of a list titled, Personnel to be Replaced. Lily stood by the door, her eyes darting through the darkness outside. "Someone's coming," she whispered. The sound of heavy footsteps grew louder, echoing from the far end of the warehouse, steady and unhurried. Caroline signaled for them to move quickly. James folded the documents and stuffed them inside his jacket. They backed toward the rear door, each step calculated to avoid a creaking floorboard. Through a crack in the door, they saw the beam of a flashlight sweep across the wooden walls. Someone was definitely searching the place. When they were back outside, the cold harbor air hit them. But before he could feel relieved, James glanced to his right and froze. Not 30 yards away, under the pier's single yellow light, stood the man in the raincoat. He didn't approach, didn't speak. He just watched them, as if he knew exactly what they had just done inside. Caroline didn't turn her head, her voice a low command. "Walk straight, don't react." Lily's hand tightened around James's. Her eyes were wide, staring over his shoulder at the figure that was already beginning to fade into the sea mist. They walked quickly toward the car, the sound of the waves and the rain merging into a relentless rhythm, pushing them away from the darkness of the seafood warehouse. The sky was just beginning to lighten, the night's rain leaving puddles of reflected light on the street. James woke up with a strange feeling in the unusually quiet apartment. The kettle hadn't whistled. The familiar smell of coffee wasn't wafting from the kitchen. Lily was always up before him, even if it was just to play with sugar packets. He walked into the living room. On the table, Lily's half-finished glass of water still bore the faint smudge of her fingerprints, but the chair was empty. He called out softly, "Lily." No answer. On the sofa was a piece of folded paper, a message scrawled in pencil. "They took me to the warehouse. Don't worry." Oh, James's heart seized. This wasn't the handwriting of a child who had been taken by force. It was steady, firm, written almost as reassurance. But that was what sent a deeper chill down his spine. Lily knew she was going to be taken, and she still left him a message. Caroline appeared a few minutes later, her hair still damp, with morning mist. James showed her the note. She glanced at it, then shook her head. "Number. This is bait. They want you back there." Then where is she?" Caroline was silent, but her eyes suddenly lit up as she looked toward the window. On the balcony railing, a smaller piece of paper was being tossed about by the wind. James went out and picked it up. Inside was a crude drawing from Lily. 3 shrimp boats, moored in a row, numbered 1, 2, 3. Below, an arrow pointed to the space between boats 2 and 3, next to a symbol of a teddy bear. Caroline tapped the paper. "We're not going back to the warehouse. We're going to the docks." They raced toward the harbor. The morning fog was thick, the cries of gulls echoing in the distance. The line of shrimp boats emerged from the mist, in the exact 1, 2, 3 order from the drawing. Between boats 2 and 3 was a narrow, dark compartment for storing nets. James climbed aboard, his heart pounding. A soft breath came from the shadows, followed by a familiar voice. "I'm here." Lily was curled in a corner, her teddy bear in her arms. James pulled her out, checking her quickly, no injuries, just shivering from the cold. Caroline stood guard behind him, her eyes scanning the docks. "Why did you leave the drawing?" James asked. Lily unzipped the bear. Inside, a small black voice recorder was revealed, its casing old and scratched. "I left it where they were talking last night. It recorded everything." James clutched the device, feeling as if he were holding the key to everything that was happening. But before he could breathe a sigh of relief, Caroline spoke quickly. "Someone's coming. We have to get out of here. Now." The sound of footsteps echoed from the wooden pier, heavy and getting closer with every beat. Thursday. The 28th floor boardroom was bright with sterile white light, its glass walls offering a panoramic view of Charleston below. A long, polished walnut table was flanked by 2 neat rows of black leather chairs. Most of the faces around the table were turned toward one man, Bobby Langston, dressed in a gray suit and a wine-colored tie, a confident smile on his face as if victory were a foregone conclusion. Evelyn sat 2 seats away from him, her notebook perfectly aligned, her eyes occasionally flicking toward James before quickly looking away, as if a single glance might reveal too much. The chairman of the board gave a light tap of his gavel. "Let's begin. The main item on today's agenda is the restructuring of senior management." His eyes drifted toward James, a purely ceremonial glance. Bobby stood, his voice clear and resonant. "Given the new circumstances and the demands of our major shareholders, we propose the transfer of executive authority from Mr. James Whitmore to a temporary executive committee until a new CEO is appointed." A few board members nodded, as if they had been persuaded long before this meeting. James sat perfectly still, his hands flat on the table. But inside, his heart was pounding in time, with the small recorder hidden in his jacket pocket. Bobby continued, with a touch of feigned magnanimity. "No one denies James's contributions. But the company needs a new direction." Just as Bobby was about to sit down, James stood up. "I agree that the company needs transparency. And for that reason, before we vote, I'd like you all to hear something." He took out the recorder, placed it gently on the table, and pressed play. A soft hiss filled the silent room, then a familiar voice. "Bobby, after Thursday, he'll be gone. Evelyn, are you sure you can get the signatures?" Evelyn, "I'll handle the schedules and the documents. No one will suspect a thing. Just make sure you handle the rest." Bobby, "It has to be clean, no traces. This is our only shot." Every word landed on the polished table like a shard of broken glass, reflecting the stunned expressions of the board members. Bobby's face went pale. Evelyn gripped her notebook so tightly her knuckles turned white. The chairman looked around the room, his voice slow but firm. "I propose we vote." Immediately, the result was nearly unanimous. Bobby was removed from the board, and Evelyn was immediately suspended, pending an internal investigation. Security entered, politely but firmly escorting them from the room. Bobby shot James a look of pure, disbelieving rage, but James met it with a cold stare, as if all explanations were now meaningless. The atmosphere in the room changed completely. A few people turned to James, and for the first time in months, their eyes held a look of acknowledgement. But for him, this victory wasn't just about keeping his seat. It was about stopping a plan that, if successful, could have ended everything, both his company and his life. When James left the boardroom, the late afternoon sun cast a golden glow down the long hallway. At the far end, Lily was waiting, her teddy bear clutched in her arms. Caroline stood beside her, arms crossed, her expression relieved but still vigilant. James walked over and gently placed a hand on Lily's shoulder. "Let's go home." The elevator doors closed behind them, carrying away the fading echo of a battle that had ended here, but had left a permanent mark on the heart of everyone who had walked out of that room. Charleston welcomed the sunset with a golden amber light that streamed across the Ashley River. From the porch of a small house on the outskirts of the city, the wind carried the smell of salt and the faint scent of jasmine from a neighbor's garden. James sat on the wooden steps, his shirt sleeves rolled up, a cup of cooling coffee in his hand. Lily sat a few steps below him, her attention focused on the teddy bear. She was stitching up the seam she'd ripped to get the recorder out. A needle, thread, and small scraps of fabric scattered on a towel beside her. Caroline leaned against the doorframe, watching them both with a rare calm she hadn't shown since that night at the warehouse. "I'm going to rename him," Lily said, looking up. "To what?" James asked. "Lucky. Because he saved your life." Her voice was as light as the breeze, but James felt it carried more weight than any thank you ever could. He smiled, but it was a thoughtful smile. In the past few days, he'd gotten his CEO title back, received apologies from some board members, and even fielded new partnership offers from overseas investors. But sitting here, watching Lily make her careful stitches, hearing Caroline's soft laugh at what she'd said, James knew those things weren't what mattered most. He had always thought being irreplaceable meant being at the top, being in control of everything. But in the end, the truly irreplaceable things were the people who dared to stand by his side when the rest of the world had turned its back. The distant sound of waves mixed with the wind sighing through the porch roof. Lily set Lucky down on the step and moved closer to James. Caroline came out to join them, a mug of hot tea in her hands, her gaze fixed on the crimson horizon. "We're a family now," Lily said, as if it were the most obvious fact in the world. James put an arm around her shoulder and looked out at the water. There were no clinking glasses, no glittering lights like at the party that night. There was only the fading daylight and a sense of peace that settled with every breath. And for the first time in months, James felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The evening air, cool and damp from the river, swirled under the porch roof. I looked down at my own hands, at the veins, the calluses, the marks of time and of the last few days. They were the same hands, but they didn't feel the same. James looked down at his own hands, at the veins, the calluses, the marks of time and of the last few days. They were the same hands, but they didn't feel the same. He used to grip everything tightly, believing that if he just held on hard enough, no one could take it away. Now he saw with perfect clarity. The most important things didn't need to be held on to. They stayed on their own. Once you stopped trying to prove your worth to people who had already chosen to turn their backs. The sound of Lily laughing softly with Caroline behind him pulled James back to the present. He left his cold coffee on the step, stood up, and went inside. Tomorrow, there would be meetings, contracts, and numbers. But tonight, in this house, James knew he didn't need to be a CEO to feel at peace. And somehow, that's what makes me ready to take the next step. If you're still listening, perhaps this story resonated with you somewhere, maybe in the feeling of being pushed aside, or in the moment of finding your footing again. I told the journey of a CEO not just to talk about power or titles, but to remind myself that sometimes the greatest victory is finding the people who will truly walk beside you. If you'd like to keep hearing stories like this, keep this channel in your list, just one click to subscribe, and you won't miss the next story I have to tell.